between drafts with the debut, and I'd sort of thought to myself, maybe this book will never get published because I can't seem to finish it. And I I thought maybe it's not my first book, maybe it's just one of those books that you leave in the drawer. And then I started working on this one at that time, you know. So I'd gone quite some distance before Stay With Me was published with this book.
Okay, so place us in time then? This would have been 10 years ago, 6 years ago?
This was, I think, about 10 years ago, actually. Oh, wow. This is 2013.
Hmm.
Yes, it was. I had just started my MA in creative writing in the UK at that time, and I had the option of submitting Stay With Me, which I was working on, or I'd finished, I think I'd done a few drafts by then. And I had two reasons. I was sort of losing faith in the book because it had gotten so many rejections from agents, and I just thought, so maybe this is not the book that is going to be the first one I published. And I also wanted to hold on to it and finish it on my own because I worried that if I worked on Stay With Me during the MA year, when I leave the MA program, maybe I wouldn't know how to finish a book. So I decided to just start working on something totally new. And that's when I started working on what will become A Spell of Good Things.
Okay, so first of all, there's a couple of things I want to flag here. Stay With Me is a book that, for a debut, had an extraordinary amount of success. It was a finalist, I believe, for the Dylan Thomas Prize. What was it? There are other prizes. It was one of these
Yeah.
debuts. So it
Yeah.
was very celebrated. And yet, when I hear you talk about this time in your life, you're talking about how you almost lost faith. You had been rejected a lot of times. I think my listeners, many of whom are writers or aspiring writers, they love to hear stories like this. I love to hear stories like this
So do
because,
I.
yeah, but it's normal is the point. It's not, I think, an abnormal situation to be in particular,
Hmm.
maybe for somebody who's debuting or trying to debut,
Hmm.
to receive resistance from agents or people just don't
Hmm.
want to give a new writer the time of day. And that was the case,
Hmm.
even for a book that went on to do so well.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was very shocked at how well it did, because when somebody finally took a chance on it, I was sort of thinking, oh, this is nice. At least it's going to be out in the world. I'm grateful for that. I don't think I had any real expectations besides that. I think just because of how long it had taken me to get to that point. So it was a really, really astonishing year, I think, and very surprising in many ways.
I think it's also interesting the way that creative projects can influence one another and the way that
Mm,
writers will sometimes run into some kind of block, whether it's like a writer's block or they just kind of hit a wall creatively with a project. They don't know which way to turn or if it's going to come together.
mm,
And so rather than sit there and kind of grind their wheels, or spin their wheels in this stuck place, they might turn to an entirely different project just to keep moving and just to kind of get away and give themselves some space. And what I'm interested in is the way that this process can free a person up and maybe give them new insight into the work that was previously giving them trouble. You know what I'm saying?
mm.
Like, was that the case?
Yeah,
A Spell of
I
Good
think it
Things,
was.
it seems to have maybe opened up some new avenues for you with Stay With Me.
I think it definitely did. That's a really good question, because with Stay With Me, one of the problems it had in the initial iterations was the structure. So I'd had the structure where we had the first half of the book from the wife's perspective, and then we go to the second half of the book and it's the husband's perspective. And I'd stayed with that for years, and I just kept editing that. And by this time I started writing A Spell of Good Things, right from the beginning, it was toggling back and forth, between different perspectives. And I think that sort of informed coming back to edit Stay With Me again and realizing that the structure was one of the major problems that it had, that I was trying to write two characters that the reader would be invested in, or at least, maybe not like both of them, but be invested in them, even if you don't agree with the decisions they make. And I realized that with that setup, by the time you get to the husband's side of the story, you're just like, I don't want to hear anything this guy has to say. I'm just done with this book. I'm going to leave now. And so definitely, I do think that it helped me to see Stay With Me and in a different way. And it opened up the possibilities in terms of the narrative structure for me.
And so Stay With Me is published, like we said, to great acclaim, nominated for all these awards, surpassed, I think, your expectations for it, it's fair to say, and launched you as a writer. And then the next step for you is to follow it up, which is what you're doing here. And, this book is publishing 6 years later. I know from reading a little bit online that it's been a busy 6 years for you in ways that fall outside of literature. You got married, you had a baby. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What was it like to try to follow it up? There's the sophomore slump or curse, or, this is something that gets talked about. Like, did you feel pressure? Was it difficult in ways that Stay With Me was not?
I think it was difficult but I mean, I'm so grateful that I had started working on it before Stay With Me came out. Because I think it would have been even more difficult to start something totally new after the first book got the kind of attention that it did. Because I think it did throw me off for about a year at least. I was just, yeah, but it was difficult in that with Stay With Me, I feel like I had a kind of freedom. Because I didn't know that anybody was going to ever read the book. I wanted people to read it. But it was like, it was like this crazy thing that I was doing, spending hours and hours on. I was telling my friends, I'm writing a book, and 3 years later, they're like, you're still writing the book, But with this one, I had an awareness of an audience, which did not exist with Stay With Me, really. And the thing that I feel that I had to do, each time I sat down to write, was to help myself to return to that point where I'm the only one in the room with, the page, and I think it's a place that is important for me, as a writer, to have that freedom to create without immediately thinking about how people might respond to what I'm writing. I want to think about that much later in the process, not when I'm actually creating.
So I also read that you delivered the final version of A Spell of Good Things less than a week before your son was born.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is because I have heard this before many times on this show from women who finished a book magically in sync with the delivery of a child. And I think the lesson to draw for women listening out there is that if you want to finish a book, get pregnant.
There's no deadline like that one.
Right. But I mean, it's true. There's some truth to it, right? You feel like, oh my God, this baby's coming. I'm never going to write again, or I'm going to have at least a year or two. Yeah. And so it's a great discipline.
Absolutely. It's so much like, if I don't do this now, I don't know when I'm going to do this. So it's right down to the wire, and yeah.
And so you got it done. So there's 6 years in between books. And I'm just curious to know a little bit about the process for A Spell of Good Things, because it's a big book. It's, sprawling comes to mind as an adjective to describe it in terms of its thematic concerns and the ground you're trying to cover. This is a book that I think assesses, the lives of its characters, but also I think in a way it assesses contemporary Nigeria. It's it's political culture, it's social culture, issues of gender and class. It's thinking about a lot of big things. And so to get to a point where you are addressing those things in a way that feels satisfactory to you while also telling a really good story, that's a heavy lift. Like, what was it like drafting this thing, and how many false summits were there?
It was incredibly messy. It was, I mean, it took. I started working on it in 2013, and I didn't turn on the final draft until last year. So that tells you how long it took. Although I wasn't working on it all the time. For instance, when Stay With Me came out, I didn't work on it for like a year at least, And I remember after the first year, I had to take some time, and I had the opportunity to go to McDowell's and had 6 weeks to just read what I'd written before again, and then sort of start all over again. Um, Writing it was, I can't even count the drafts really, to be honest. It was so I mean, you've read the book, so to just illustrate how I had to redo so many things. There are two anchor characters. We have these two families, and we're going back and forth between the two families, and we're going to different members of the family, but there are two anchor characters that we sort of stay with from the beginning to the end. And in the present, in the final version, it's Eniola, who's a teenage boy, is from a poor family, and the other's Wuraola, who's a young doctor who's just starting out, and she's from a richer family. In the first draft, it was Eniola and the younger sister in the other family. So it was two teenagers, who were the anchor characters. And I wrote that for maybe about 60,000 words before I realized I don't think this character can carry this story. And I think that, and I sort of also realized that I was trying to avoid some of the things that the older sister was going through. So the story was this older sister story was there, but I was refracting it through the younger sister's, perception. And so it was a lot of those kind of realizations, and then going back to the beginning again and rewriting until I had a draft that I could then edit. Um, yeah.
Okay. So some things that I think are important to underline: 60,000 words of stuff that you had to rewrite pretty much entirely. 60,000 words that didn't
Yeah.
work. 60,000 words is the length of many novels. So for people
Yeah.
listening, I mean, listen, people, this is the way it gets done. And I think it's important, to point it out, because it can feel like such a disaster as a writer when you discover or finally learn that, oh my God, I'm 60,000 words in and this needs to be redone. But it takes that kind of persistence and some sort of emotional equilibrium. Like, how do you manage the emotional side of writing when it comes to enduring the inevitable failures of the process, or the learning processes embedded within the process,
Absolutely. Um, it's tough, really. It's very. I mean, yeah,
just crying a little bit.
yeah. There's a lot of crying and frustration. But what I started doing with this one, because it just feels, and for me, I feel like it always seems to take forever for me to finish a book. You know,
Me
um,
too.
so it gets a bit frustrating. But what I try to do is try to do some small projects, um, just to give myself a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. So I could write a short story, like even 600 words, just something that I feel this is the beginning and this is the middle and this is the end. And I finished it within a month or within a week. And it might not go out of my computer, but it gives me a sense of having done something with my life that is.
That's how I feel about this
Yeah.
podcast. It goes out every week. I'm like, look, I did something.
Yeah.
It feels like it's like a necessary emotional experience to like actualize something and put it out there, or even just actualize something and be able to point to it on your computer screen. That's enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just to give listeners like a broad sense of what you're doing, you talked a little bit about it, but you have these two central characters, Eniola, who is a teenage boy from a poor family in Osun State. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, that's Osun
Okay,
State,
so
yeah.
Osun State is in Nigeria, and this boy's father has been laid off. He's a teacher, and it sounds like you're drawing, forgive me for not being super well versed in Nigerian political history, but it sounds like that you were drawing on actual experiences that you've borne witness to in Nigeria, where there were mass layoffs of teachers, and this story kind of reflects that, correct?
Yes, and it's fine. I think many Nigerians outside of Ocean State probably don't even know this history. You know, it's one of those things that happens on a local level and doesn't necessarily, make the catch the national attention. But it happened when I was a teenager. And it was something that I saw play out for many people um, around me.
Okay, and his father is deeply depressed. This is a man who can't make a living anymore, who's lost his livelihood and is not handling it with a ton of resilience. I think he's really down on his luck. So Eniola has lost, that energy in the household. His dad just kind of stays in bed. And his family is reduced to having to beg ultimately. There's a lot of, there's a lot of subplots. He's working for a tailor to help bring in some money and to get himself an apprenticeship for a possible livelihood. He's also trying to attend a private school called, if I have this correct, Glorious Destiny Comprehensive Secondary School. Is that right?
Yes.
So he's trying to go to Glorious Destiny, but he can't afford the school fees. And so there's corporal punishment. There's like beatings that he has to endure because he's not paying his fees. And then he's got this very bright younger sister for whom school is very easy, and she wants to be some sort of scientist. She loves to be out in the forest, and I think forestry is her interest. So that's just the backdrop for this poor family, and Eniola is one of the anchor characters. The other anchor character who you mentioned earlier is Worola, who is a doctor in what kind of hospital? It was characterized, I remember I was reading a review, and I'm blanking on the way. It's an underfunded hospital, right? Is that?
Yeah, it's a public hospital, but it's, as many of them are, it's very underfunded.
Okay. One of the things I really admired about your drawing of Wariola is how real seeming the medical scenes are. And I was like, wow, like, does she have medical training? And then I found out that you have a sister. You're the daughter of a doctor, and you have a sister who's a doctor in a similar situation, correct?
Yeah, I'm sort of the only person in my immediate family who's not a doctor. So I've sat on a lot of conversations, and I literally would go sometimes from secondary school to the hospital and spend like hours there before going on, waiting for my mom to be done. So I've spent a lot of time in hospitals.
So this was easy for you, really. It was like second nature. And you had somebody to call if you ever had a question.
Yeah.
So Wariola is betrothed. Is that right? Is that engaged? Is that engaged, or does that mean you're married?
No, I think that means you're engaged.
Okay. So she's engaged to a well-born Nigerian guy named Kunle. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, Kunle.
There's a lot of accents on vowels, I noticed. Is it Yoruba? I'm trying to like...
Yes, it's a very tonal language.
Okay, because I was like reading, and I'm sitting there trying to I'm like looking at the different... I don't even know what these accents mean in anything. So I'm looking to see how to pronounce, but it's Kunle is the guy's name.
Yeah, that's pretty good, actually.
All right. So she's engaged to this guy. It's a good marriage from the perspective of class, and I think her parents are very excited about it because they know she's going to be taken care of if she marries this guy. She'll be in a stable financial situation. But he is hot-headed, shall we say, and abusive, frankly. And I think the story that you're telling with her gets into a lot of the gender politics of Nigeria. And
Hmm.
this story takes place in in the aughts. It's not
Yeah, in the early arts. Yeah.
okay. And so just to contextualize things for listeners who might not be aware, Nigeria has in the last several decades had a relatively volatile political situation. There have been big shifts, like
Hmm.
politically, in terms of how the country is governed. And I believe in the early aughts, you would be in the wake of the end of a dictatorship and the beginning of democracy. Is that right?
Absolutely. The military regime ended in 1999, so we sort of entered into the new millennium with, this very new democracy.
Okay. And that I think is informing, maybe not in a direct way or an explicit way, but in an implicit way. I could feel that. And I think that there is an explicit element of politics to the plot because Kunle comes from a family that has political interest. It's a moneyed family, and the father is interested in the governorship of the state of Osun. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then there's a rival family that also factors into the book. So we get to see the machinations of how power works, at
Mm,
least, in an oblique way. And uh, it's not always pretty, shall we say. And I was telling you before we came on, I never really do any pre-reading before I read a book for this show. It feels like I'm on an assembly line because I'm doing so many interviews. And so I'm just reading. I'll open a book and I'll just start reading. And when I opened your book and started reading, I was like, oh, wow, she's going to get married. She's in this relationship. There's this young boy. They're going to school. I thought for a second, I was like, wait, are they going to wind up together? It kind of had this feeling of what's going to happen. And my expectations were thwarted. And, I was quickly, disabused of those notions. And this is a really rich story. It's also like a tragic story in a lot of
mm,
ways. There's a lot of hard realities at play. I think one of the things that this book does beautifully is it takes the plight of Worola, who is doing well for herself. She's a doctor. She's kind of done the right things, right? She's ticked that box.
mm,
She's got this stable career. And then she's got this boyfriend who wants to marry her, who is all the things that, on paper a person could want. And yet he's not such a great guy.
mm,
And she's trying to navigate those tensions. Something I did not realize to a full extent is the gender politics of contemporary Nigeria, or at least
mm,
Nigeria in the recent past.
mm,
Polygamy still
mm.
happens. Like that's still a part of Nigerian life, at least in certain echelons. Is this correct?
Yeah, yes. It depends on what part of the country you're in. Um, but from the part of the country that I'm from, it's not as common, I think, as it was, say, maybe 60 years ago. But I still have uncles who at least have three wives. So
Oh,
it's not so, um, okay, one uncle actually, that I can think of immediately. It's not as far-fetched. Yeah, it's not as common, but it's not unheard of, really.
generationally, is it shifting? Like for your generation or for people younger than you? Like, is it changing? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, do you feel like attitudes are shifting with generations? Is this something that's more of an older generation thing, or is it still?
I think that on the surface, I think it appears to be. I'm a bit suspicious, because I don't think that people let go of advantages very easily. Um, so I. I think it remains to be seen. I would want to check in 20 years and see what some of the young men who are getting married now have done, because the other thing that I think, and I can say for sure, is that I think even where the practice of polygamy is not the case, um the reality of it is weaponized, even in relationships. You hear people say, well, at least he did not marry another wife. So
By the way, that's a very low bar. That's a very
yeah,
low bar.
I know. So I think there's still that, it's sort of still in the water in a certain type of way. I mean, there was some woman who gave an interview um, in the newspaper. I won't say who she is. She's relatively famous in Nigeria, and her husband recently married a second wife, and she gave an interview and was saying, how all men do this, and I'm thinking, no, maybe not. I don't think so, but So I think. I don't know, honestly. I think it's not as common as it used to be. Um, but just the kind of power that it gives men in a relationship, in an intimate relationship, I don't think that has necessarily been relinquished.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point you make about people who have these entrenched advantages not wanting to relinquish them, even if they are unjust or
Hmm.
wrongheaded. People will cling to those
Yeah.
advantages as birthrights or something. It's
Yeah.
you see it all over the place. But you do a really beautiful job of drawing an abusive relationship. It's very harrowing to read, but it's right there. You don't shy away from that dynamic between Kunle and Wariola, and just the pressures that she's under to make what she believes to be the right decision. She has all this joy and excitement on on her family side with her mother, especially, I think, being really happy about it, and then she's got her new in-laws who are obviously overjoyed about it, and she's caught in the middle of it and doesn't want to disappoint. And then, I hope I'm not spoiling too much, but let's just say someone learns of the abuse, in her family. Someone in her family learns of the abuse, and this destabilizes things, and it makes it impossible for her to fully deny what's happening. I think it kind of sets her on her course of discovery, or moves her in the direction of a resolution. Let's just put it that way. And I think another thing that I noticed, and I'd love to hear you talk about, is the sense of tradition that you might feel in writing a socio-political novel about Nigeria. I know that there is the epigraph from T.M. Aluko in his 1966 novel Kinsman and Foreman. That seems to be, I mean, the book is divided into sections. I think it's 4 sections, and each one
Yes.
has epigraphs which feature, I think, the work of writers, Nigerian writers whom you admire.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you
Yeah.
talk just a little bit about their influence, and maybe the way that their work might inform each section or the book overall?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, I mean, I'll begin with Everything Good Will Come, which is a novel about Nigeria in the 80s. It's
And
the
who is
country's,
it by?
sorry, by Sefiata. Sefiata.
Okay.
And it's about Nigeria in the 1980s, and the country at that point is under military dictatorship. Amongst many other things, I think it's one of those Nigerian novels that when I read it, I could recognize, so many things and understand. I felt like it helped me to understand many things about the country, and that it articulated some of the things that I had perceived. I read it maybe when I was 19 or 20, that I was perceiving um, and could not yet articulate. I think it gave me the language for those things. And it's a book very much about the country and very much about what it means to be a woman in Nigeria. And there's quite a bit of gender politics, and it's that intersection between the ordinary lives that people are living, and it's pushing up against the state of the nation itself. So it's a book that um means a lot to me. I really like it. And I, even with the title of A Spell of Good Things, I wanted to pay homage to that book and hope that people could that it was in conversation with this book. And then we go to On Black Sister Street, which is about um
By
oh sorry, I keep forgetting this.
that's okay.
Black Sister Street by Chika
Okay.
Onigwe. And this is about a group of a group of women who are living outside of Nigeria and working as sex workers, and it's really, and I think part of what the section that it sort of informs is a section that really looks at the transactional way that women go into some of the relationships, that happen in this book, and how, at least for a particular character, marrying somebody was her way of surviving. It wasn't really a love match as much as this was her way to survive, and what does that mean, for the marriage? What does that mean for the kind of mother that she becomes and the kind of values she's trying to pass to a daughter and what marriage means to her too. And then I think we go from that to Waiting for an Angel by Helena Bila, which is also another book about oppression and the oppression of the state in Nigeria. And then finally, Every Day is for the Thief by Teju Cole, which, is really this immersion of in Lagos. It's a book about a city, and in that sense, I hope that it was in conversation with this book. A Spell of Good Things was in conversation with that, in that it is also very much about a city, and there's also what I'd always thought about in relation to the title of that every day is for the thief is, it's a saying, and there's a second half of the saying, and it's every day is for the thief, one day is for the owner. And I find it very interesting that the title is Every Day for the Thief. Is for the thief, because if every day is for the thief, does the owner really ever get a day? And I wanted to think through. It's one of the things that I think the novel tries to process. If injustice is so rife, is there ultimately that one day when there's some form of justice?
And the title of your book is, I think, drawn from a line in the book. Worola's, is it Woriola or Worola?
Worola's mama, yeah.
Worola, yeah. Worola's mother, Yeye. She says, quote, "Life was
Mm,
war, a series of battles with the occasional spell of good things." And I think
mm.
that speaks to what you're talking about, like how I feel this. I think so many people around the world feel this with respect to the world, which has got so many problems, and they all seem to be reflections of one another, maybe different variations on the same theme a lot of the time. And it's just like, are things going to get better? Are they getting better? Or is this just it? It's just going to be a big mess with the occasional spell of good things.
Oh my goodness. It all sounds so bleak.
I say, do you feel more optimistic than that or less optimistic than that?
Um, I think I feel more optimistic than that. And I think the optimism is probably also a coping mechanism, because otherwise, um, yeah, I do actually honestly feel more optimistic than than that. But with this book, I didn't want to. I didn't want to. I didn't want to avoid what, by the time I had finished it, felt like the reality of the world that I had created. You know, I wanted to go in there and face the things. I'd said earlier, for instance, with that in an initial draft I had the younger sister be the Hancock character. And I think part of it was that I really just did not want to go through this harrowing thing. I wanted to see it refracted through, the younger sister. I didn't want to be there with Rala. But by the time I came back to it again, I realized that was what I needed to do for this book. That I needed to go there, and yeah, I hope it worked.
It did, and it's a really good thing to talk about and to point out is the way that we as writers so often avoid things and trick ourselves. It's amazing to me sometimes when I catch myself avoiding something. I've spent a year on something and it's like, oh, and you eventually have to cop to it, right? And you have to go to the difficult place because that's exactly what the reader wants you to do. The reader doesn't want Worla's experiences with domestic abuse to be refracted through the sister's lens. They want to be right there where the drama is happening. And, I guess that theoretically there could be a compelling reason to have the story told from a distance, but I think
Yes.
I think you made the right choice is what I'm getting at. And it's just interesting how it takes us a while sometimes to make that choice.
Yeah.
Was there something in particular that you learned in the earlier draft that wasn't was it just not working, or was there something you arrived at that made you pivot?
I think it just was not working. I think it just was not working, and I think what I the I think what happened was one half of the story was working, and then the other half wasn't, and it was primarily, I think, because I'd gone with the wrong character as the anchor character, so that it was just a bit lopsided. By the time I read it, that it was that thing where it felt like, even when I was reading it, I was like, I want to get back to the other people. These people, I don't know why I'm reading about these other people. I want to go back to that other family because their story is more compelling, to me. So that was it. I think, yeah. I hope it take. I know. I hope the next one doesn't take as long to figure out.
I feel you. I say the same thing about my last book took me 10 years to write. So I'm just like,
Oh
please,
my
God, let me get this next one done in 3 years, like
Yeah.
a normal human being.
Yes.
um, so I want to talk to you about drawing a little bit more about drawing Eniola's family. They have a very hard scrabble existence. Uh, just accessing their world. I know, you came of age, the child of doctors, or a mother who is a doctor, well educated. I don't know if you came up. It doesn't seem like you came up against these kinds of issues as a child. I'm just wondering about writing that experience. Like, obviously, you bear witness to it, maybe from a distance, but how did you get inside the lives of those people with such accuracy and feeling of verisimilitude, and also like that emotional reality? Like, how did you get there?
I mean, I think it was two things. I think the first thing was, um, and I think that with writing any character, it's for me, that sometimes there's something that I sometimes do, that I did with this book, was to pick a character and write about their day from like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and just write, this is the first thing they do. And then after that, they do this. And then after that, they do this, and just write my way through their day. And I feel like it helped me to get a sense of who they were and their core aspirations, their internal monologue, the metaphors of their lives. And so I think for me, it was the first thing was to begin with these characters as, first of all, as human beings, not as, oh, this is a poor family. That wasn't what I began with. It was, this is a family, this is this person, this is this other person. And then start layering every other thing onto that, you know. The second thing was that I think I had a little bit of um access in that um my mom's family, my maternal grandparents live lived, one of them is late now, lived in the part of town that I'm writing about, that this family lives in, in my mental landscape. They live a few houses away from my grandparents, and it was a place that I visited quite a bit as a child. It wasn't where my family lived, and my grandparents had sort of um, had a leg up, and it's that thing with that was possible, for my mother's generation. That my mother's parents were not affluent, but the public school systems, the systems were still working in a way that my mother could have the kind of mobility that when I went to visit my grandparents, whenever I would go to visit my grandparents and I would look around, was not available to the children who were living in that neighborhood now,
Yeah.
And so, and for me, it was one of the things that I sort of wanted to tease out, that people were also seeing their access points sort of fizzle out, and disappear, um, in a very tangible way. So that was some of what I remembered and I built with. My grandmother still lives there, and I visit, and I mean, sometimes I spend a week with her. So that was the other access that I had. But I think that the most important thing is really to come to a character, as a human being, and try to get to understand what their internal life is like, and try to then think about what else is happening in the environment that feeds into that.
That's a really good point, because I think it can sometimes, especially if you're writing outside of the scope of your own lived experience, it can be
Hmm.
intimidating to try to do that imaginative work. And it sounds like what you're saying is like, well, what does this person have for breakfast? What do
Yeah.
they do right when they wake up? Do they pray? Do they go outside and like feed the livestock? Like whatever it is, like if you start to get into those everyday details, that alone
Mm.
can maybe kickstart the process of creation, and you can start to really see them as people rather than, you know, bear the weight of this creative burden as you're thinking of it, like, oh my God, I have this responsibility to get it right. It's easy to kind of psych yourself out.
Yeah. It's so easy.
So I want to talk to you about politics and the knowingness about that part of Nigerian life that this book conveys. You grew up in a household where politics was talked about, and this had to, I think, be a good education for the writing of this book. But I'm also curious to know, like, was there a unified, like, political viewpoint in your household, or was it ever contentious? You know what I'm saying? Was it the kind of household where everybody was kind of discussing politics, but everybody was sort of on one side? Or was it the kind of thing where there was a fluid discussion happening and people were kind of batting ideas around and disagreement was permitted?
I think disagreement was encouraged. um, yeah, and I think there was always that thing where the discussion would be going in this direction, and somebody would just be like, "No, but what about this?" And I would wonder, and this was often my sister, would wonder, "Do you really mean this, or are you just saying this to get a rise out of the rest
Uh-huh.
of us?"
Right.
you know so it was disagreements happened, and a lot of arguments, in the elections last two elections, my mother and I were on opposite sides of the she was convinced, I was convinced about who I wanted to vote for. She was convinced that it was the worst decision ever, and I think she has been proven right. But uh,
Should have listened to your mom.
yeah, right until that morning, I was still making a case to her, and she was just like, no.
But I think that's great. I think that's great I think that's the way, I mean, I hope to be as a parent is to, and that's the way I was raised, where you can have dialogue even and especially when you disagree. That's so healthy. And that's something that I think in American culture anyway has gotten lost. It's like, if you don't agree with me, then we're just not speaking. There's a lot of that. There's people just talking past one another. But I don't think you could write probably a good novel that deals in politics and political realities without maybe having some foundation for that in your youth, or some place where you got to sort of experiment and dialogue about this stuff. Or maybe it's like you didn't have it at all, and maybe you turned to writing as the place to find it. But it makes more sense to me that you were raised this way and that you had these concerns front of mind even as a child.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and it's something else you mentioned earlier, which speaks to me in my experience, because I have 2 kids and trying to get them educated. And one of the concerns that, the central concerns, the practical central concerns of your book is this family, Eniola's family, trying to get their children educated. And you mentioned that previous generations in Nigeria had a functioning public school system that allowed for mobility. And we live in Los Angeles, where the public school system is, let's just say, inconsistent at best. There are some good public schools, but it depends where you live. You got to be in the right district, and a lot of them are substandard. And as a parent, you're left with these choices where it's like, well, you either go to a private school and pay all this money to educate your kids, or you send your kid to school every day knowing that you're giving them a substandard education. That's a terrible choice for a parent to have to make. And what I will always argue, like, not always to great effect at cocktail parties, and I don't even go to cocktail parties, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but I don't believe that private school should be legal. Like, maybe if there is like a religion thing, you really want your, I know there's going to be loopholes people find, and a lot of times they'll say it's a religious thing, but really what it is, at least in the States, and maybe it seems like it's the same in Nigeria, is it is a way of securing privilege and advantage, educational advantage, but also I think social advantage is a huge part of it. By sending your kids to these private schools where they will be associating with other kids from wealthy families, and those kinds of relationships carry through and they confer a real advantage. And so it drives me crazy to hear people talk in the United States of America about equality of opportunity and all this bullshit, because it's really not the case. If we really believed in equality of opportunity, then the children of millionaires and billionaires would be going to public school with the kids of working class families and people who don't have nearly the advantage. And if that were the case, then the public schools would be great. If rich people had to send their kids to public schools, like, the politics around it would change like that. So forgive me for getting on a soapbox, but this really bothers me.
I'm on the soapbox too.
Yeah.
We're together on this.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I speak as a kid that went to a private school, and I started in a public school, because, my mom thought that was the right thing. And after the first term, I didn't know anything, and I think she just said, okay, you've got to go to, I mean, by the time it got to my sister, she didn't even go to any public school. And I think it's really fractured society, because, I then got into university, and in the university before, I mean, or even up till now, the public university systems were much better. At that point, I was getting to university, and I was in class with people who were very bright, but I could tell that they didn't have a good secondary school education, and therefore they were struggling. And it just even then seemed unfair, to be evaluated alongside with people who did not have the same opportunities that I had, in terms of education. And it's unfortunately only gotten worse. And what I believe, where I think we should start in Nigeria, is that everyone who holds public office must sign a contract that their children are going to go to public schools. Every single person.
Right.
You can't send your child to a private school if you want
Exactly.
to hold public office. So I'm right there with you on that soapbox.
Yeah. I think it would change things dramatically. And I should also add, if I have this correct, I believe that in Finland, which is consistently rated as having the best schools in the world, private school is illegal. And I think we're so far from that politically in the United States. It's not even part of a conversation people are having, you know, in a common way. But it's like, wow, this is just really an entrenched caste system, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so cruel to children. It's cruel to
Yes.
children who don't have privilege. And
Mm-hmm.
no decent society would do that to kids. So we're an indecent society until we fix it, is my view.
Yeah.
So anyway, your book spoke to me on that level, and I was really rooting for Eniola. He's a very sympathetic character and a tragic character. And, you know, it's really an achievement to, I think, write the life of a guy like him and to get in, like, kind of get inside his existence and to really make the reader understand how a bright child with so much promise like him can wind up, you know, as what do you call him even? Not a hitman necessarily, but a heavy for like a political, for a political player who's kind of dictatorial and authoritarian in his bearing. And suddenly Eniola, just because he's lost and he's searching for resources and an identity, winds up working for this guy and winds up doing things that he has absolutely no interest in doing. You know, compromises himself morally. And it's, that's a great tragedy. And I think oftentimes the way that we perceive these tragedies is just at the back end of it. All we hear is the news story about, you know, so-and-so was beaten or killed or kidnapped, and so-and-so was arrested, and he's 17 years old or whatever it is. But we never really get the story of how that 17-year-old got to that point. And you humanize that so well in this novel.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Oh. I'm glad it comes across that way, because it's one of the things I really wanted to do with this character.
Must have been hard to write.
It was.
It
was.
How do you, and I think too, like, you write about something like this, I can imagine the writing getting too emotional. Like, to write it well, I mean, obviously you want to create an emotional effect. But if your viewpoints as a writer, I think, become too intrusive or explicit on the page, it can actually ruin the fiction. Did you struggle with that in earlier drafts at all?
Yes, absolutely. I think I struggle with that with my fiction, actually, because I mean, with my first novel, for instance, in one of the earlier drafts, which is probably why it kept getting rejected, one of the earlier drafts had, you know, the husband character joins a political party just because I had things to say. Stay with me.
This is Stay With Me. Okay, yeah, this is not your new book. It's the debut.
Yes, this is Stay With Me. And, you know, the character just joins this political party, and then there's just this section where he's going on campaign. And then just, you know, and it's really just because I had something I wanted to say about, you know, the 1993 elections in Nigeria. But that was in the novel to do that, you know, and until I came to accept that, I don't think it was going anywhere. And the same with this book, that I think I always have to peer back, you know, on certain things and remove some of my soapboxing and really just stay with the character and what they care about right now and what is impacting their life right now, you know. And I think that can be more compelling, you know, than my 10-point agenda.
Four, we should add your eventual campaign for governor of Ocean State. I look forward to this.
Oh my goodness!
You make the big career. You make the big career shift into politics.
That's not the way Nigerian politics is right now.
Oh,
No. But yeah, that's hilarious. But it's something that I definitely struggle with, because it's, and I think part of it is trust in the story, and trust in the reader also. And trusting that you're giving the reader enough for them to have their own response to what is happening, not thinking that I have to come and lecture them and say, this happened in chapter 5, but it is wrong, just in case you think it is right.
right.
Yeah, it's something that I'm constantly having to check myself on, I think.
Well, I think it's like this struggle between like fiction and nonfiction almost. I don't think it's the responsibility of fiction to do polemic, to make those kinds of like explicit arguments. I think what it comes down to for me as a writer and as a reader is that when a political novel is done well, as yours is, it humanizes the political, because ultimately that's what it's about, right? These political machinations can seem really abstract to us, or just like annoying, or what's even going on? These people are awful. What are they doing? But the truth is that, and this is what I will often argue when people become really cynical about politics and kind of nihilistic and disaffected about it, and they disavow participation. They say, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not paying attention to that. It's not affecting, I always say, listen, politics determines how fast you can drive. It determines, what gets taught in schools oftentimes. I mean, we're dealing with this right now, whether or not books are banned. I mean, there's all sorts of decisions that affect the everyday lives of people. So you can say it's corrupt, you can say it's insane, but you can't say that it doesn't matter.
It does.
Yeah. So I think it's important to show the ways that it matters. That's what I think a good political novel usually does, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what one of the things that I hoped this book will do, show the impact of many of these decisions that come down on the radio, like, oh yeah, this is going to happen, and these people have decided that, the governor has decided that, we don't need history teachers anymore, we don't need people who are teaching the humanities. That I wanted to think about 5 years later from this, how is this affecting ordinary everybody's life? Like, I'm really interested in that, and finding a way to show that in fiction, because I do think they matter. And I think that, I sometimes think that they even tend to matter more in places where there are no safety nets. That the impact of politics is even more intense, in that sense, because there's nothing for people to fall onto. Yeah.
Well, this is a beautiful book. It's another one of these books. It's totally engrossing. I said this about a novel by a guest of mine just last week. I love books like that. They just take you away and, really bring, I guess, recently contemporary life in Nigeria into focus for me. And, and it's a book that really speaks to human experience that translates, across cultures, across borders. This is a very human story and just beautifully told. And I hope that the next book you write doesn't take 6 years. But I mean, if it does, I'll wait,
So
but let me ask you, I always ask, do you have anything that you're working on? Is there another book that you're working on to kind of keep things rolling? Or are you just taking a break after this one to kind of enjoy motherhood? Or
I sort of have something I'm working on, but I feel like I'm going at probably an even slower pace, just because I used to be that person who I was very nocturnal before I had a baby. I would just stay up all night and go to bed like 5 a.m. And now it's not something that I've done in a very long time. So I really loved working in the quiet of the night.
Mm-hmm.
So my pacing is very different now.
It's interesting. People who are night owls, like real night owls, that is a biological thing. Like I have my brother-in-law is that way. He can stay up all night, loves it, loves to go to bed at like 6 a.m,
Yeah.
sleep half the day, get up and just like live on that clock. That is a specific biology. Like that's a thing that people are wired for. And what I wonder is that if this is the case for you, then you become a parent or you get a job, say that, your hours are 9 to 5. You have to work during the day and go to sleep at night. It's got to be tough for people who are wired to be night owls to have to invert their biology, right?
I mean, the first thing is the sleep. When the baby sleeps, it does not work for me. Like the baby goes to bed maybe 7:30, and 1 a.m. I'm still sort of trying to get myself to sleep. So I mean, I haven't figured it out yet. So it's this thing where I'm like, I have to sleep. I have to sleep. I have to sleep. I still haven't slept.
I know that's the worst, right? Where you're like pressuring yourself. You feel like you're failing.
Yeah.
Maybe the answer though, I think because I struggle sometimes with sleep, I'll wake up in the night. I can go to sleep, but then I wake up in the night. And I'm just like, you know what? Sometimes maybe just get up. Like, don't force yourself. If you're up, you're up. Get up and start doing stuff. And just, if you get tired enough, you'll sleep. Maybe the key is to just exhaust yourself.
Yeah.
But as a new parent, that should not be too difficult,
No, it's not. I feel like I'm always exhausted. But somehow, I think just because I'm so used to being up all night. I mean, it's so wired into me that I remember one of the things that I remember my mom saying to me. I was about 14, and she came to my room at 2 a.m. and I was reading a newspaper, and she was like, "What are you doing?"
What do you mean?
Yeah, I think it's just so hardwired into me that even when I'm exhausted, it's like I'm just still. I seldom fall asleep before midnight. Just yeah.
So can you give me any hints about what this next project is, just in a broad sense? Like, is it a novel? Is it?
Yeah, it's a novel. What's it about?
What's it concerned with?
Yeah, what it's concerned with? I think it's concerned with heart, in a particular kind of way. It's about a piece of heart. It's about it. It's a wood carving, really. That's sort of like a family heirloom, and I think it's multi-generational. I don't know. That's what I have right now.
I understand, but that gives us an idea. It gives us an idea. I always like to ask, and I understand too that like things can change. So if your next book comes out and my listeners pick it up and there's not a wooden heart in the book, they shouldn't hold you to it, right?
Yes, please don't.
Well, listen, always fun to talk with you. I'm so glad to get a chance to catch up and to help you celebrate the publication of A Spell of Good Things. It's a great book.
Thank you so much.
And I will let you now get back to it's evening in Nigeria. So you're going to be up for a few hours. Go read the newspaper, do whatever you do at, this time of night. And I hope that you find time to enjoy this moment, because for writers who write books and publish books, usually these kinds of moments don't happen all that often. It's every few years at the most, right? So enjoy it, and congratulations again on, the new baby, the marriage, the book, all of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.